All right, we're going to talk today about news and feature photography and some differences between the two and how you can take better photos when it comes to both news photos and feature photos. Too many times as photographers, we attend an event with an imprecise vision of what it is we want to capture. But if we have a basic understanding of the difference between news and feature photography, then we can learn how to plan for each of those different scenarios. In this tutorial, you will hopefully start to understand some of those key differences between news and feature photography, which can help you then plan better photos. In journalism, we often talk about the differences between news writing and feature writing. In news writing, we use the inverted pyramid with the goal of telling readers all of the important details about the event. The idea is to get as much information to a reader as possible in an efficient manner. Feature writing, though, is about telling a story. Writers are allowed to use more artistic storytelling methods because the focus is on capturing and holding the reader's interest rather than just communicating facts. Whether you realize it or not right away, photojournalism applies those same basic concepts when you consider differences between news and feature photography. If you take a look at the differences presented on this slide, you can see how some of those differences apply here as well. News photography is all about telling about something concrete, informing readers, showing specific details about an event or an occasion. Feature photography, though, is about more the emotional response, the humanity, the culture, that slice of life that a photographer manages to freeze in time. So, depending on whether or not you're taking news or feature photos, you have to think about ways that you can apply some of those ideas. And here's some rules that might help you out a little bit. So here's the first tip for news photography. Look beyond the obvious. In this photo, the obvious situation would have been the beach volleyball game occurring. But here, the photographer looked beyond it to tell two different stories. Not just the game happening, but the spectators and the bright, sunshiny day. It just creates a more interesting picture because my eye has more to look at beyond what is just the obvious. Next, we often talk about focusing on reaction rather than action. But too many times we relegate that to the sports photography area when we should be using it in many different areas. We've all seen the photos of the line of homecoming candidates lined up on the field during halftime of a big game. But we often miss the reaction photo that happens right afterwards, the announcement of the winner, and the celebration or the defeat of those individuals. If you look for the reactions, you'll notice that they tell a much more candid story than what happens in the more polished moments. Setting is really important, and it's something that many beginning photojournalists forget. If the setting for your photo isn't right, the subject of your photo won't look right either. You have to think about the setting ahead of time and how you can minimize those distractions and maximize the visual effect. In this photo, the journalist captures not just the subject itself, the drummer, and the powder exploding off the drums, but he or she utilized a really unique angle in order to minimize distraction of the other drummers in the background or what's going on the field. That helps us to see exactly what's going on in the picture without being distracted by what's happening behind it. Sometimes, though, we get so focused on visual interest that we forget to focus on the subject, and that can cause some confusion for our viewer and make us miss the mark entirely. So, it's important to identify your subject first and then use that determination to make other decisions about visual interest. In this photo, the subject is obviously the person tossing the ring, and the angle of the photo highlights the subject for the viewer while providing visual interest, rather than taking away the emphasis from the subject and focusing on something else. Finally, for news photography, while we never hope for tragedy, much of the impact of photography comes from photographing intimate or sensitive moments. In these times, we really have to remember the code of ethics and tell the story of what is happening while still being sensitive to the rights of others. We should never impose on someone's privacy just to get a good shot. So in times of intimacy or tragedy, think about ways you can capture the seriousness of the situation without violating a person's need for space. Kind of like in this photo here of an injury. In addition to news photography, there are many tips that you can keep in mind while shooting for features as well. The first tip is to keep your focus on the human subject. In feature photography, it's often really tempting to focus on an inanimate object, like a pill bottle or an empty field or something like that. Even shots of a classroom can really remove a human aspect because the viewer doesn't know which student to focus on. So, when you're taking photos, make sure that you get rid of that guesswork and focus on something human, because that's one of the really surefire ways to keep your viewer emotionally invested in your photography. Next, try to keep your subjects from posing. This is really, really tough to do, but it's still really important. Instead of posing, encourage them to continue to do exactly what they would be doing if you weren't there. It might take them a little bit of time to warm up to the idea and really forget about the camera, but the result will be a photo that feels much more natural than if you started shooting as soon as you arrived on scene. One of the best things about feature photography is the ability to play around with juxtaposition and other kind of absurd aspects. Just keep in mind that as a photographer, your job is to capture the silly, not to create it yourself. Here's a good example of a feature photo about students and stress. It focuses on the juxtaposition of light and dark, and while it's obviously a more posed illustration, it doesn't come across as cheesy as a lot of setup shots do. And just like with juxtaposition, it's important to think in extremes. Being safe almost always means you end up with a terrible shot. So think about how you can avoid safe and go for either a wide shot or an extreme close-up. This photo has the potential to be too busy and to lose a viewer, but because it's so close up, the viewer can't get lost in the busyness of the image. If the photographer would have backed up even half a step, the entire image would have been lost because you wouldn't have known where it was that you were supposed to be focusing. Finally, feature photography is all about being patient. If you're shooting news photography for a press conference, you can snap a shot or two and then be done. But feature photography is about the story behind the story, or the lesser told tale. No one tells a journalist the lesser told tale in the first 2 minutes of an interview, and no one shows that tale to a photographer who just arrived on scene. Being a photojournalist isn't about showing up for a 5-minute cameo. It's about entrenching yourself in the field, sometimes very literally, and making yourself such a permanent fixture that people forget to put on a cheesy face. It takes time and it takes patience, but if you can use that time and utilize that patience, it is almost always worthwhile.